Welcome to Displaying Data and Handling Events section. By the end of this section, we will be able to display data on our template view, handle events, format data using pipes, and much more. So let's go. In this video, we will see the difference between the DOM property and HTML attribute. And we will see how we do DOM property binding in Angular and how to bind to HTML attribute. So let us go. We saw in section 1 how to bind data and show it dynamically on the template using the interpolation. The interpolation in Angular is happening when we add two curly braces around the component field. In our case, the component field is hello world. Another example here is to show a label on a button, like here, and I add the curly braces between the component DOM, hello world, and I close the double curly braces, save, and let's see the navigator. Great. Another way to do binding is to bind field component to DOM property. So we can rewrite the previous example as follow. In our HTML is a DOM property for bottom element, and here in our HTML we're binded to the component field hello world. And don't forget, we put the inner HTML in a square bracket. So let me recap. The double curly braces is called the string interpolation, while the square braces is used for DOM property binding. We should differentiate between the HTML attribute and the DOM properties. Get in mind, Angular data binding is all about binding to DOM property and not HTML attributes. So the question that come in mind, what is the difference between the DOM property and HTML attribute? HTML attributes is defined by HTML, while DOM properties is defined by the DOM element. HTML attributes initialize the DOM property. Once the initialization complete, the attributes job is done. So, property value can change while attribute value cannot. Let us prove the last point by an example. Let me include an input element DOM as follow. So here I have an input. I give it an ID name input ID and I assign to its HTML attribute value a string value. So let us check the navigator. You see here we have the input with the property value assigned to value. So let us hit F12 and check the console. So if we type input ID dot value, so it typed the string value, and this is the DOM property. Now let's type input ID dot get attribute for the HTML attribute value. So it's the same thing. Now let us change the attribute value to value 1, and let's repeat. So input value, so input ID dot value, see, it's updated to the new value, value 1. While input ID get the attribute value, it's still having the old value. So as I explained earlier, attribute value cannot change while DOM property can. Now to finish our talk about property binding, in some rare cases, there are HTML attribute that does not have corresponding DOM property. Like for example, the call span for cell in table. So let me give an example. So let's have a table with a cell TD, and here I'm trying to bind the attribute value call span to a field component call span. And let me create component field call span and give it to the value and initialize it to value 2. So let me check the navigator. There is nothing on the screen. So let me check my console. You see here the error? Well, the error here is clear. It says cannot bind to ColdSpan since it's not a non-property. Actually, ColdSpan is an HTML attribute, and there is no corresponding DOM property to this ColdSpan. Similar way, some DOM properties does not have HTML attribute, like for inner HTML, for button, as we saw earlier. So to bind to this attribute, I should suffix ColdSpan with the word attribute dot. So let me check my navigator. You see? No more error. So we saw in this video the difference between the DOM property and HTML attribute. We saw also how to do the DOM property binding in Angular, and also how to bind to HTML attribute.